Alira Voss stood in the center of the great hall, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole pack could hear it. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on her. The torches on the walls threw long shadows across the stone floor, and the air felt heavy, like a storm about to break. She had waited her whole life for this moment, the moment when the moon bond would be confirmed in front of everyone, when the man standing across from her would call her his mate, and mean it. Instead, Cale Ashgrove looked at her the way a hunter looks at a wounded animal he has decided not to save. "I reject you," he said. The words landed like a blow. Alira felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay standing. Around her, gasps rippled through the crowd. Some pack members turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned forward, hungry for the drama, the way people always are when someone else's world is falling apart. Cale did not look away from her. His eyes, a deep and cold shade of gray, held no warmth at all. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the Ashgrove pack, a man who had built his reputation on control, on never letting anyone close enough to hurt him. When the moon had chosen Alira as his mate 3 days earlier, he had not celebrated. He had brooded. He had questioned. And now, standing before his entire pack, he had made his decision clear. "You cannot mean this," Alira whispered, though she made sure her voice did not shake. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not in front of everyone who had come to witness what should have been the happiest night of her life. "I mean every word," Cale said. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had already convinced himself he was doing the right thing. "You appeared in my territory 3 weeks ago, with no family name anyone recognizes, no pack to claim you, and no explanation for why the moon chose you of all people. I will not tie my throne to someone who might be working against me." A woman near the front of the crowd let out a small, cruel laugh. Alira recognized her. Ophelia Grant, one of Cale's closest advisors, a woman who had never hidden her dislike for the idea of Cale having a mate at all. Ophelia believed the Alpha King should belong only to his pack, not to any one woman. She had spent weeks whispering doubts into Cale's ear, and now, watching her work pay off, she looked almost delighted. Alira felt anger rise up beneath the hurt. She had done nothing wrong. She had come to this territory because the moon itself had guided her, because something ancient and undeniable had pulled her toward this pack, toward this man. She had not asked to be his mate. She had not schemed her way into his life. And now he stood in front of everyone and called her a threat, a stranger, a possible spy, as though the bond between them meant nothing. "I have shown you nothing but honesty since the day I arrived," Alira said, her voice finally rising, carrying across the silent hall. "I have answered every question your advisors have asked me. I have offered to prove my loyalty in any way you wanted, and still you stand here and reject me in front of your entire pack, as if I am nothing." Cale's jaw tightened. For one brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that almost looked like doubt. But he buried it quickly. The way he buried everything that made him feel less than completely in control. "This is not personal," he said. "It is the most personal thing that has ever happened to me," Alira answered. The hall was utterly silent now. But even Ophelia had stopped smiling, sensing that the moment had shifted into something rawer than she had expected. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, an old woman shook her head slowly, murmuring something about the moon never forgiving a rejected bond. Alira looked around at the faces watching her. Some held pity, some held judgment. None of them would help her, she realized. None of them would stand up and say that what Cale was doing was wrong. He was their Alpha King, and his word was law, even when his word was cruel. She turned back to Cale one last time. She wanted to say so many things, to scream at him, to beg him to look past his suspicion and see the truth of what she felt for him, a truth she had not even had time to fully understand herself. But she saw the wall in his eyes, the same wall he showed to everyone, and she knew that nothing she said tonight would change his mind. So instead, she said something else, something true and terrible. "You will regret this," she said quietly. "Not because I will make you regret it, because you will look back one day and understand exactly what you gave up tonight." Cale said nothing. He simply turned away, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable, and walked out of the hall as though nothing important had happened at all. The crowd parted for him, murmuring, some bowing their heads as he passed, none of them daring to speak against their king. Elira stood alone in the center of the hall for a long moment after he was gone. The torches flickered. The whispers grew louder now that he was no longer there to hear them. She could feel the pity and the curiosity pressing in on her from every direction, and she knew she could not stay there 1 second longer. She walked out of the hall with her head high, refusing to let anyone see her cry, though the tears were already burning behind her eyes. She did not stop walking until she reached the small guest room she had been given, at the edge of the Packlands, the room that had never truly felt like home, not once in the 3 weeks she had lived there. Only when the door was closed behind her did she finally let herself break. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, and pressed a hand to her stomach. She had not told anyone yet, not even Cale, though she had planned to tell him that very night, after the ceremony, when they were finally alone. She had imagined 100 different ways the conversation might go. She had never imagined that there would be no ceremony to follow, no private moment where she could share her secret, no chance at all. Now she understood that she could never tell him, not after what he had done tonight. If a man could reject his mate in front of his entire pack, because of nothing more than suspicion and pride, what would he do if he learned she was carrying his child? Would he claim the baby only out of duty, the way a king claims an heir, without any real love for the mother who carried it? Would he see the child as another possible threat, another stranger he could not fully trust? Or worse, would Ophelia Grant, and whoever else in his circle wished her gone, see the child as a problem to be solved permanently? The thought sent a cold shiver through her. She had heard the stories, the way power in a pack like this one could turn ruthless when threatened, the way an unclaimed heir born to a rejected mate could be seen as dangerous rather than precious. She thought of the way Ophelia had smiled tonight, as though she had won something important. She thought of the whispers she had already caught in the halls, quiet conversations that stopped the moment she walked past. Elira pressed both hands against her stomach now, as if she could shield the small life growing there simply by holding it close. "I will protect you," she whispered into the empty room. "No matter what it costs me." She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the small window of her room, watching the moon rise higher over the Packlands, the same moon that had chosen her for a man who did not want her, the same moon that had somehow also given her the one gift she would never regret, no matter how much pain had come with it. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Elira had made her decision. She packed only what she could carry easily: a small bag with a few clothes, a little money she had saved, and a locket that had belonged to her mother, one of the only things she still had left from the life she had lived before the moon had led her here. She left no note. She did not say goodbye to anyone. She slipped out of the Packlands just as the sun began to rise, moving quickly and quietly along paths she had learned during her short time there, paths that led away from the main territory and toward the wider world beyond it. She did not know exactly where she was going. She only knew that she could not stay, not after last night, not with the child she now had to protect above everything else. As she reached the edge of the territory, she paused and looked back one final time. The Packlands stretched out behind her, the great stone hall where she had been rejected rising above the trees, the home she had hoped to have, now nothing more than a memory she would carry with a mixture of sorrow and quiet, burning determination. She thought of Cale's face in that final moment before he turned away, the coldness in his eyes, the complete absence of doubt. She thought of the words he had spoken, words that had cut deeper than any physical wound ever could, and she thought of the small, fragile life inside her, a life that deserved better than to grow up unwanted, better than to be used as a political tool by a father who had already shown he did not trust her. "He will never know," she said softly to herself, and though the words felt like another wound opening, she also felt something steady settle inside her, a resolve that would carry her through everything that was still to come. "I will raise this child myself. I will make sure they are safe and loved, and never made to feel like a mistake." With that, she turned away from the Packlands for what she believed would be the last time, and began walking toward a future she could not yet see, carrying with her a secret that would remain hidden for years, a secret that would one day return to change everything. Behind her, the sun rose fully over the Ashgrove territory, casting long golden light across land that would soon forget her name, though it would never truly forget what had happened beneath the moon that night. Somewhere in the great stone hall, Cale Ashgrove sat alone on his throne, staring at nothing, telling himself over and over that he had made the right choice, that he had protected his pack, that a king could not afford weakness. He did not yet know how wrong he was. He did not yet know what he had truly lost. And he had no idea that, many years later, the truth would return to him in a way he could never have imagined, carried by a child with his own eyes, a child who would force him to face every mistake he had made on that cold, unforgiving night. For now, he knew only one thing: Elira Voss was gone. And though he told himself he did not care, some small, buried part of him already knew that her final words to him had been a promise, not a threat, and that promise would follow him for the rest of his life. Elira walked for 3 days before she stopped feeling like she might collapse from exhaustion. She kept to the smaller roads, avoiding the main paths that connected the great packs, because she knew that news of a rejected mate leaving Ashgrove territory would spread quickly, and she did not want to be found, not by anyone loyal to Cale, and especially not by anyone loyal to Ophelia Grant. She slept in small inns when she had enough coin, and beneath the trees when she did not. She was careful with her food, careful with her strength, always thinking now, not just of herself, but of the small life growing inside her, a life that depended entirely on her ability to stay safe and keep moving. Every time exhaustion tempted her to stop, to rest longer than she should, she pressed her hand to her stomach and reminded herself why she could not give up. On the 4th day, she reached the edge of a small settlement called Brindlewood, a town that belonged to no pack in particular, home instead to a mix of wolves who had left their birth packs and humans who had learned to live peacefully beside them. It was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions, where a woman with no family name and no explanation for her travels could simply exist without suspicion. Elira had heard of it once, years ago, from a traveler passing through her childhood village, and something about the memory of that conversation had stayed with her, tucked away until she needed it most. She found a small room above a bakery, offered to her by a kind older woman named Margaret, who ran the shop alone since her husband had passed. Margaret did not ask why a young woman would arrive in town with nothing but a single bag and eyes that looked like they had not slept in days. She simply offered her a room, a warm meal, and the promise that she would not have to explain herself unless she wanted to. "Everyone who comes to Brindlewood is running from something," Margaret said on that first night, setting a bowl of soup in front of Elira, with hands that trembled slightly from age, but moved with practiced ease. "Doesn't matter what it is. What matters is what you do once you get here." Elira found herself grateful beyond words for the older woman's quiet kindness, the way she asked nothing and offered everything, the way she seemed to understand instinctively that some wounds needed time before they needed words. Over the following weeks, Elira settled into a rhythm. She helped Margaret in the bakery each morning, kneading dough and tending the ovens, work that kept her hands busy, and her mind, at least for a few hours each day, away from thoughts of Cale and the hall, and the rejection that still echoed in her memory every time she closed her eyes. She told no one in Brindlewood the truth of who she was or where she had come from. When Margaret gently asked, weeks later, whether the father of her coming child knew about the baby, Elira only shook her head and said quietly that it was complicated, and Margaret, wise enough to recognize pain that did not want to be picked open, let the subject rest. As the months passed, Elira's body changed, and with it, her sense of purpose sharpened. She was no longer just a woman running from heartbreak. She was becoming a mother, and every decision she made now had to account for the small life that would soon depend on her for everything. She spent her evenings reading whatever books Margaret could find for her about caring for a newborn, about the particular challenges faced by wolf children, about how their bodies sometimes shifted earlier than expected, how their wolves could be unpredictable in the first years before proper control settled in. She thought often about Cale during those quiet months, though she tried not to. Sometimes she would catch herself staring out the small window of her room, watching the moon rise, and she would remember the way his eyes had looked before he rejected her, the brief flicker of something that might have been doubt, might have been fear, might have been anything other than the coldness he had shown to everyone else in that hall. She wondered, in her weaker moments, whether things might have been different if she had simply had more time to prove herself to him, more time to show him that she was not a threat, that whatever pulled the moon toward choosing her had nothing to do with schemes or politics. But then she would remember the way he had turned and walked away without looking back, the way he had not even asked her to explain herself privately before condemning her in front of hundreds of witnesses, and her resolve would harden again. A man who could do that to someone the moon had chosen for him did not deserve a second chance, not with her heart, and certainly not with the child she now carried. Margaret became something like family during those months, filling a space that Alira had not realized was empty since she had lost her own mother years earlier. The older woman taught her small things, practical things, how to manage money carefully, how to read the weather before it turned, how to trust her instincts about people, even when she could not explain exactly why. She also taught her something less practical but perhaps more important, how to laugh again, even in small moments, even when grief still sat heavy in her chest. One evening, as autumn began turning the leaves outside Brindlewood into shades of gold and deep red, Alira sat by the window of her small room, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the first flutters of movement that told her the child inside her was growing stronger every day. She thought about names, turning over different possibilities in her mind, imagining who this child might become, what kind of person they might grow into, far away from thrones and rejections, and the cruelty of packs that valued power over kindness. She did not know yet whether she carried a son or a daughter, but already she found herself making promises to the child, quiet vows spoken into the dark of her small room. She promised that she would never let them feel unwanted, the way she had felt unwanted in that great stone hall. She promised that she would build a life for them filled with warmth, even if that warmth came from a small bakery in a town that belonged to no pack, rather than a grand hall belonging to a king. She promised that she would tell them the truth about their father one day, when they were old enough to understand, though she was not yet sure what version of that truth she would choose to share. And she promised herself, above everything else, that she would never again let anyone make her feel as small as Cale Ashgrove had made her feel on that final night in Ashgrove territory. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited her as a single mother in a town far from everything she had once known, she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her out of that hall and away from that pack, one careful step at a time. Outside, the moon climbed higher over Brindlewood, indifferent to the lives it had changed, indifferent to the king who sat brooding on his throne many miles away, indifferent to the woman who watched it now with tired eyes, and a hand pressed protectively over the future she was determined to protect. It simply continued its slow path across the sky, the same as it always had, the same as it always would, carrying with it secrets that would not surface again for many years to come. 3 years passed in Brindlewood, and the small town had become the only home Alira's son had ever known. She had named him Ronan, a name she chose simply because she liked the sound of it, a name with no connection to any pack, any bloodline, any history that might one day cause him trouble. He had her dark hair and her quick, curious mind, but his eyes were unmistakably his father's, a deep and striking gray that sometimes made Alira's chest tighten with old memories whenever he looked up at her. Ronan was a bright child, full of questions, endlessly curious about the world around him. He had already shown early signs of his wolf, small flickers of golden light in his eyes when he was excited or upset, a strength in his small hands that other children his age did not have. Margaret, who had become something like a grandmother to him, often remarked that he carried himself with a confidence that seemed far too large for a boy his age, as though some part of him already understood that he was meant for something more than the quiet life of a small town. Alira worked hard to give him as normal a childhood as she could. She had taken over most of the running of the bakery, as Margaret's health began to decline slightly with age, and between kneading dough each morning and caring for Ronan each afternoon, her days were full in a way that left little room for dwelling on the past. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, usually late at night after Ronan had fallen asleep, when the memories crept back in anyway. She thought of Cale less often now than she had in those first months after leaving Ashgrove territory, but she never thought of him without feeling something complicated stir in her chest. a mixture of old hurt and something else she refused to name, something that felt dangerously close to longing whenever she let her guard down for too long. She pushed those feelings away quickly whenever they surfaced. She had built a life here, a good life, and she would not let old wounds reopen simply because time had softened their edges. What Alira did not know, because Brindlewood was far enough removed from the politics of the larger packs that news rarely reached them with any real detail, was that the Ashgrove pack had changed considerably since the night she left. Kale's reign, always firm, had grown harder, colder, more absolute. Where he had once been strict but fair, he had become the kind of alpha king that other packs spoke of in careful, wary tones, a leader who trusted almost no one and who had quietly pushed away every advisor who dared question his decisions too openly. Ophelia Grant remained close to him, one of the few who had survived his growing distrust of nearly everyone around him, though even she had noticed the change in her king with something like concern, though she would never have admitted it aloud. Kale's wolf, the part of him that should have settled once he found and bonded with a mate, remained restless, aggressive, difficult to control in ways it had never been before the night of the rejection. His advisors whispered among themselves that no alpha's wolf ever fully recovered from turning away a chosen mate, that some deep instinctual wound simply never healed, no matter how much time passed. Kale refused to acknowledge any of it. When his healers suggested that his increasing bouts of restlessness and irritability might be connected to the rejection, he dismissed them coldly and told them to focus on matters that actually mattered to the pack's survival. He told himself, over and over, in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, that he had made the right decision that night. A king could not afford to be ruled by uncertainty. A king could not risk his entire pack on a woman whose origins remained a mystery, no matter what the moon claimed about their bond. But even as he told himself this, some part of him, buried deep beneath years of careful discipline, could not stop wondering what had happened to her. He had made no effort to find out. Pride had prevented him from asking, and duty had kept him occupied with the endless demands of ruling a pack that grew more complicated to manage with each passing season. Still, on nights when the moon hung particularly full and bright over Ashgrove territory, he found himself standing at the window of his chambers, staring out at the same sky that had once bound him to a woman he had thrown away, wondering, despite everything, whether she had found happiness somewhere far from him. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself this so often that he almost believed it. Back in Brindlewood, Alira had no idea that the man who had rejected her still thought of her at all. She had built her entire understanding of him around that one final image, his cold eyes, his unwavering certainty, his refusal to even consider that he might be wrong. She had no reason to imagine that beneath that hardened exterior, doubt had continued to grow, quiet and persistent, refusing to be silenced, no matter how firmly he tried to bury it. Ronan, meanwhile, grew stronger and more curious with each passing month. He asked about his father sometimes, the way young children often do, simple questions without any real understanding of the weight behind them. Where is my father? Why doesn't he live with us like other fathers do? Alira had prepared herself for these questions long before he was old enough to ask them, and she always answered gently, carefully, giving him just enough truth to satisfy his curiosity without burdening him with the full weight of what had actually happened. Your father lives very far away, she would tell him, kneeling down to his level, brushing his dark hair back from his forehead. He doesn't know about you yet, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean anything is wrong with you. It just means our path led us somewhere different than his. Ronan usually accepted this answer without much further questioning, the way young children often accept the strange and incomplete explanations adults give them, filing the information away without fully understanding its implications. But Alira could see, even in those early years, a certain sadness that settled behind his gray eyes whenever the topic came up, a quiet longing for something he could not quite name, something Alira feared she would never be able to fully give him, no matter how much love she poured into raising him herself. She often wondered, in her private moments, whether she had made the right choice in keeping Ronan a secret. She told herself, as she had told herself 1,000 times before, that she was protecting him, that a king, who had rejected his mate without hesitation, could not be trusted to embrace an unexpected heir with anything resembling genuine love, that the political dangers of revealing Ronan's existence far outweighed whatever benefit might come from Ronan knowing his father. But some nights, watching her son sleep peacefully in the small bed across their shared room, she felt a flicker of doubt creep in, a question she could never fully answer, no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind. Was she protecting Ronan from danger, or was she protecting herself from having to face Chaol Ashgrove ever again? She never let herself sit with that question for too long. Whatever the true answer might be, the life she and Ronan had built in Brindlewood was safe, stable, and filled with more love than either of them could have found in the cold political world of Ashgrove territory. That, she told herself firmly, was enough. It had to be enough. As Ronan's 4th birthday approached, Margaret's health continued its slow decline, and Alira found herself taking on more and more responsibility for the bakery, working longer hours to keep the business running, while also caring for her increasingly curious and energetic son. It was a hard season, full of exhaustion and worry, but it was also, in its own quiet way, a season of deepening love, as Alira watched her son grow into a bright, kind, and remarkably perceptive little boy who brought light into every room he entered. She had no way of knowing that far away, in the great stone hall of Ashgrove territory, a border dispute was quietly brewing, one that would soon bring Chaol Ashgrove and his advisors much closer to Brindlewood than either of them could have imagined, setting into motion a chain of events that would finally, after 4 long years, bring father and son face to face for the very first time. A dispute over grazing land along the southern border had turned tense enough that Chaol decided he needed to handle it personally, rather than send one of his advisors in his place. 2 smaller settlements, neither belonging fully to any pack, had begun arguing over a stretch of farmland that both claimed rights to, and the disagreement had grown heated enough that both sides had sent urgent requests to Ashgrove territory, hoping the Alpha King's authority might settle the matter before it turned into something worse. Chaol traveled with a small group of his most trusted guards, moving quickly along the southern roads, eager to resolve the dispute and return to his territory as swiftly as possible. He had little patience these days for matters outside his immediate pack, but border disputes, if left unchecked, had a way of spreading into larger conflicts, and he could not afford instability along his southern edge, not with rumors of unrest stirring among some of the neighboring territories. The road to the disputed farmland passed directly through Brindlewood, a town Chaol had visited only once before, many years earlier, and remembered only vaguely as a quiet, unremarkable settlement that caused no trouble for anyone. He planned only to pass through it briefly, stopping perhaps for a single night to rest his guards before continuing on to settle the border dispute the following morning. He arrived in Brindlewood as the sun was beginning to set, the town bathed in soft orange light, its streets busier than he remembered, filled with the ordinary sounds of daily life, merchants closing their stalls for the evening, children playing in the open square near the town's central well, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a small bakery near the edge of the main road. Chaol paid little attention to any of it at first, focused instead on finding suitable lodging for himself and his guards before darkness fell completely. It was as he dismounted near the town square, stretching muscles stiff from hours of travel, that he first noticed the boy. The child could not have been older than 4, with dark, unruly hair and an expression of fierce concentration as he chased after a wooden toy that had rolled away from him near the well. There was nothing particularly unusual about a child playing in a town square, nothing that should have caught the attention of an Alpha King with far more pressing matters on his mind. But something about the boy made Chaol pause, made his eyes linger longer than they should have, a strange, uneasy feeling settling in his chest that he could not immediately explain. It was the eyes. When the boy finally caught his runaway toy and looked up, momentarily distracted by the sight of unfamiliar guards standing near the well, Chaol found himself staring directly into a pair of gray eyes, so similar to his own, that for a moment, he genuinely wondered if he was imagining things. It was not simply that the color matched, it was the exact shade, the particular depth and coolness of it, a shade so rare that Chaol had never once, in all his years of ruling and traveling, seen it duplicated so precisely on another face. Before he could move or speak, an older woman appeared beside the boy, moving with surprising speed for someone with visibly graying hair and lines of age around her eyes. She scooped the child up into her arms with practiced ease, murmuring something Chaol could not hear, and began walking briskly away from the square, casting one quick, wary glance back over her shoulder as she went. Cale felt something instinctive stir within him, a pull he could not name, an urgency that made him want to follow, to ask questions, to understand why the sight of that particular child had unsettled him so deeply. But his guards were waiting for direction, and the practical matters of finding lodging and preparing for the following day's negotiations demanded his attention, and so, reluctantly, he let the moment pass, telling himself that he was simply tired from the journey, that his mind was playing tricks, born of exhaustion. He did not sleep well that night. The image of the boy's eyes kept surfacing in his mind every time he closed his own, refusing to be dismissed, no matter how firmly he tried to push the thought away. By morning, he had convinced himself that he needed to see the child again, if only to satisfy his own curiosity, and put the strange unease to rest before continuing on to handle the border dispute. He rose early and walked through the town on his own, without his guards, dressed simply enough that most people did not immediately recognize him as the Alpha King of Ashgrove. He asked a few quiet questions at the local market, describing the boy he had seen the previous evening, and was directed, eventually, to a small healer's cottage on the edge of town, where, he was told, an elderly woman named Margaret lived along with a young mother and her son. Cale approached the cottage carefully, his heart beating with an unfamiliar unease he could not fully explain. He knocked, and after a moment, the same older woman who had scooped the boy up the previous evening answered the door, her expression shifting quickly from polite curiosity to something guarded the moment she recognized who stood before her. "I saw a child in the square yesterday evening," Cale said, keeping his voice as calm and unthreatening as he could manage. "A boy, about 4 years old. I would like to ask you a few questions about him." Margaret's grip on the door tightened almost imperceptibly, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't know what child you mean," she said, her tone polite but firm, the kind of practiced deflection that told Cale immediately she was lying. "Please," Cale said, and something in his voice, some rare note of genuine uncertainty rather than command, seemed to give the older woman pause. "I only want to understand something. I am not here to cause trouble." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his face, and Cale had the distinct impression that she was weighing something important, deciding how much danger his presence truly represented. Finally she spoke, though her words offered him little satisfaction. "Whatever you think you saw, Alpha King, it is not your concern," she said. "This is a peaceful town. We do not welcome outside interference in the lives of our residents." And with that, she closed the door firmly, leaving Cale standing alone on the small porch, more unsettled than he had been before he knocked. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, every instinct in him screaming that something important was being hidden from him, something that connected directly to the strange, unshakable feeling that had gripped him since the moment he had seen that boy's eyes. He thought about pushing the matter further, about using his authority to demand answers, but something held him back, some instinct that told him force would only close doors more firmly rather than opening them. Reluctantly, he returned to his guards and continued on toward the disputed farmland, forcing himself to focus on the negotiations that awaited him, though his mind kept drifting back to that small cottage on the edge of Brindlewood, to the boy with his eyes, to the fierce protectiveness in the old woman's expression when she had spoken. The border dispute took 2 full days to resolve, longer than Cale had anticipated, as both settlements proved stubborn in their demands and required careful, patient negotiation before finally agreeing to a fair division of the farmland in question. Throughout the process, Cale found his concentration wavering more than it should have, his mind repeatedly returning to Brindlewood, to the mystery he had left unresolved there. When the negotiations finally concluded, Cale made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of returning directly to Ashgrove territory, he told his guards he wished to pass back through Brindlewood once more, before heading home, offering no explanation beyond a vague reference to wanting to ensure the town remained stable, given its proximity to the newly resolved border dispute. His guards, accustomed to their king's unpredictable moods, did not question the decision, though a few exchanged curious glances behind his back. Cale ignored them, focused entirely on the pull he felt drawing him back toward that small, unremarkable town, toward answers he was beginning to suspect might change everything he thought he understood about the night, 4 years earlier, when he had rejected the one woman the moon had ever chosen for him. As he rode back toward Brindlewood, memories he had spent years trying to suppress began surfacing with unexpected clarity. He thought of Elira's face in that final moment before she disappeared, the fierce determination in her eyes even as tears threatened to fall, the words she had spoken, words he had dismissed as an empty threat, but which now echoed in his mind with new and unsettling weight. "You will regret this, not because I will make you regret it, because you will look back one day and understand exactly what you gave up tonight." Cale had told himself for 4 years that those words meant nothing, that Elira had simply been lashing out in pain, saying whatever she could to wound him as deeply as he had wounded her. But now, riding back toward a small town where a boy with his exact eyes played in the square, under the watchful protection of a woman who clearly knew far more than she was willing to say, Cale found himself wondering, for the first time, whether her words had been something else entirely. A promise, rather than a threat, a warning of a truth that had been growing, unseen, for 4 long years. He arrived back in Brindlewood as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square, and this time, he did not hesitate. He went directly to the small healer's cottage, and when Margaret opened the door once more, her expression immediately hardening at the sight of him, Cale spoke before she could turn him away again. "I need to know his name," Cale said, his voice low and urgent, all pretense of calm authority stripped away, replaced by something rawer, something closer to desperation than he had allowed himself to feel in years. "The boy. I need to know his name, and I need to know who his mother is." Margaret's expression flickered, just briefly, something like sorrow passing behind her eyes before the guarded wariness returned. "Why does it matter to you, Alpha King?" she asked quietly. "You have no children. Everyone in this territory knows that." "Please," Cale said again, and this time his voice nearly broke on the single word. I think I already know the answer. I simply need to hear it said aloud." For a long, tense moment, Margaret said nothing at all, studying him with an intensity that made Cale feel as though every secret he had ever tried to hide was being laid bare beneath her sharp gaze. Finally, she stepped back from the doorway, just slightly, and spoke 4 words that would change the course of everything that followed. "His name is Ronan," she said. "His mother's name is Elira." The name hit Cale like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs entirely. For 4 years he had told himself she was gone, had convinced himself, in his darker moments, that she might even be dead, lost somewhere in the wide world beyond his territory, the consequence of a rejection he had never allowed himself to fully examine. And now, standing on the small porch of a healer's cottage in an unremarkable border town, he understood, with absolute and devastating clarity, that Elira Voss had been alive this entire time. And she had given him a son. Cale stood frozen on the small porch, the name still echoing in his mind. Ronan. His son's name was Ronan. 4 years of assumptions, 4 years of telling himself that Elira's disappearance meant nothing beyond the resolution of an unfortunate mistake, 4 years of burying a truth he had never even known existed, all of it collapsed in the span of a single sentence, spoken by an old woman he had met only twice. "Where is she?" Cale asked, his voice barely steady. "I need to see her. I need to see them both." Margaret's expression grew even more guarded, and she stepped fully out onto the porch now, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, as though physically placing herself between Cale and whatever lay inside the cottage. "That is not my decision to make," she said firmly. "Elira has built a life here, a safe life, away from everything that happened in your territory. I will not simply hand her over to you because you finally decided to come asking questions." "I am not here to take anything from her," Cale said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized how hollow they might sound to a woman who had clearly watched Elira arrive in Brindlewood broken and alone 4 years earlier. "I only want to understand. I want to know my son." "Your son," Margaret repeated, and something bitter crept into her voice now. "You did not want to know anything about children 4 years ago, Alpha King, when you stood in front of your entire pack and rejected the woman carrying him. Forgive me if I find your sudden interest difficult to trust." Her words landed with the precision of someone who had heard the full story, every painful detail of that night in the Great Hall, and Cale felt shame rise up hot and uncomfortable in his chest, a feeling he had rarely allowed himself to experience in the years since. He had told himself for so long that his decision had been reasonable, protective even, a king's necessary caution against an unknown threat. Standing here now, faced with the consequences of that decision made real in the form of a small boy with his own eyes, he found it impossible to maintain that justification any longer. "I was wrong," Cale said quietly, the admission feeling foreign and difficult on his tongue, words he had not spoken aloud in longer than he could remember. "I was wrong that night, and I have carried the weight of not knowing what I lost for 4 years, without understanding why it hurt as much as it did. Please, let me at least speak with her. If she asks me to leave and never return, I will honor that. But I cannot walk away now without trying." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, weighing something Cale could not quite name. Finally, she sighed, the sound heavy with years of protecting a young woman she had clearly come to love as family. "I will speak with Alira," she said, "but I make no promises about what she will decide. She has every right to refuse you, and if she does, you will respect that, Alpha King or not." Cale nodded, gratitude flooding through him despite the uncertainty of what might come next. "I understand," he said. "Thank you." Margaret disappeared back into the cottage, leaving Cale alone on the porch with his thoughts racing in directions he had not allowed them to travel in years. He thought of the way Alira had looked at him that final night, the fierce, wounded pride in her eyes, even as he tore her world apart in front of witnesses. He thought of the courage it must have taken for her to leave everything behind, to build an entirely new life alone, carrying a child she had chosen to protect, rather than risk exposing to a father who had already shown he did not trust her. Minutes passed, though they felt to Cale like hours, each one stretching endlessly as he waited on that small porch, uncertain whether the door would open again with an invitation or a final, firm rejection. When it finally did open, it was not Margaret who stood there, but Alira herself, and the sight of her stole whatever composure Cale had managed to maintain up to that point. She looked different than he remembered, older in ways that went beyond simple years passing, a certain hardness in her posture that had not existed 4 years earlier, a wariness in her eyes that made his chest ache with the understanding of exactly what he had caused. But beneath that hardness, she was unmistakably the same woman the moon had chosen for him, the same fierce spirit that had stood before him in that great hall and refused to break, even as he destroyed everything she had hoped for. "Cale," she said, and his name on her lips, after 4 years of silence, carried more weight than he had thought any single word could hold. "Alira," he answered, and found that beyond her name, he had no idea what to say next, every carefully prepared explanation and apology evaporating the moment he actually stood before her again. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment, 4 years of separation and unspoken history hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Alira stepped back from the doorway, just slightly, not quite an invitation, but not quite a refusal either. "You should not have come here," she said, though her voice lacked the sharp edge Cale might have expected. "But since you have, I suppose we should talk. Not here, though, not where he might overhear." Cale nodded, understanding immediately that she meant Ronan, that whatever conversation was about to unfold needed to happen away from small, curious ears that were not yet ready to understand the complicated truth of their existence. Alira led him a short distance from the cottage, to a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree at the edge of a nearby field, far enough from the town that they would not easily be overheard. "How did you find us?" Alira asked once they had stopped walking, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, her expression carefully guarded in a way that told Cale she had spent years learning to hide her true feelings behind a composed exterior. "I saw him," Cale said, "in the town square. I recognized something in his eyes immediately, though I did not understand what I was seeing at first. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to come back and ask questions." Alira's expression flickered with something complicated, perhaps surprise that he had noticed something so specific, perhaps simply exhaustion at finally facing a conversation she had spent 4 years hoping to avoid entirely. "I never planned to tell you," she said quietly. "I want you to understand that clearly, before anything else. I did not run because I was afraid of confronting you eventually. I ran because I genuinely believed, and still believe, that you would not have wanted him." The words cut deep, deeper than Cale had expected, though he understood immediately that he had earned every ounce of pain behind them. "I cannot argue with that belief," he admitted, his voice rough with genuine regret. "Given how I treated you that night, I understand completely why you would think that. But Alira, I need you to know that everything has changed since then. I have spent 4 years regretting a decision I did not even fully understand the consequences of, and now that I know the truth, I cannot simply walk away and pretend I never learned it." Alira's eyes searched his face for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether the emotion she saw there was genuine or simply another performance from a king accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. "What exactly are you asking for, Cale?" she said finally. "Because I need you to be honest with me, right now, before this goes any further. Are you here because you actually want to know your son, to build some kind of relationship with him, no matter how difficult that might be? Or are you here because an alpha king cannot stand the thought of an heir existing outside his control?" The question struck Cale harder than he expected, forcing him to examine his own motivations with an honesty he had rarely applied to himself. He thought of Ronan's eyes in the town square, the fierce concentration on the boy's small face as he chased his toy, the instant, undeniable pull he had felt even before he understood why. He thought of the years he had spent alone on his throne, his wolf restless and unsettled, some part of him always searching for something he could not name, something he now understood had been the absence of the family he had thrown away without ever truly understanding what he was giving up. "I do not know how to be a father," Cale admitted honestly. "I do not know how to fix what I broke between us, and I understand if that damage is beyond repair. But I know that walking away from this now, pretending I never learned the truth, would be a mistake I could not live with. I want to know him, Alira, not as an heir, not as a political asset, as my son." Alira studied him for a long moment, her expression difficult to read, years of careful self-protection warring visibly with something softer that flickered briefly beneath the surface. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "This will not be simple," she said. "There is history here that cannot be undone with good intentions alone. But I will not stand in the way of Ronan knowing his father, if you are truly willing to earn that place in his life, rather than simply claiming it, because you believe it is owed to you." Cale nodded, relief and gratitude and fear, all tangled together in his chest. "I understand," he said. "I will earn it, whatever that takes." Neither of them could have known, standing beneath that oak tree with 4 years of unspoken history finally beginning to unravel between them, that the true danger awaiting them was not the difficulty of rebuilding broken trust, but something far more sinister, a threat that had followed Alira from Ashgrove territory the moment she fled, one that had never truly stopped searching for her, and that was now, with Cale's unexpected discovery, closer than either of them realized. In the days that followed, Cale found himself torn between two lives, the demands of his throne pulling him back toward Ashgrove territory, while every instinct he possessed urged him to remain in Brindlewood, to spend every possible moment learning the truth of the years he had missed. He compromised by sending word to his advisors that pack matters would need to be handled without him for a short while longer, offering no detailed explanation beyond a vague reference to unresolved business along the southern border. It was during this extended stay that Alira finally told him the full truth of why she had never attempted to contact him, why she had chosen silence and distance over any possibility of confrontation, even after Ronan was born and the reality of raising a child alone had settled fully upon her. What she revealed left Cale cold with a different kind of horror than the guilt he had already been carrying. They sat together in Margaret's small kitchen one evening, Ronan already asleep upstairs, the quiet of the cottage broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of settling wood. Alira wrapped her hands around a cup of tea she had not touched, staring into it as though gathering courage for words she had held inside for 4 long years. "I did not leave only because you rejected me," she said finally, her voice low and careful. That would have been reason enough, I think, for most women. The humiliation alone, the pain of being cast aside in front of everyone who mattered. But that is not the whole story, Cale. Cale leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. Then tell me the rest, he said. Please, I need to understand everything. Alira took a slow breath before continuing. 2 nights after the ceremony, before I had fully decided what to do, someone came to my room, she said. Late, after most of the pack had gone to sleep. I never saw their face clearly. They wore a hood, kept their voice low and disguised. But they made it very clear that if I was carrying your child, and they seemed to already suspect that I was, even before I fully knew it myself, that child would never be allowed to grow up as a threat to certain interests within your pack. Cale's blood ran cold. A threat, he repeated. What did they mean by that? They meant, Alira said, her voice tightening with old fear, that a rejected mate's child, if born, would represent a complicated question of legitimacy and inheritance that certain people within your circle had no interest in dealing with. They told me, quite plainly, that accidents happen to unwanted complications, and that I should consider very carefully whether I wanted to risk staying in a territory where such accidents were possible. The words landed like a physical blow. Cale felt something violent and protective surge through him, a rage he had not experienced in years, directed entirely at the unknown figure who had threatened Alira and their unborn son in his own territory, under his own supposed protection. Someone threatened you, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Someone in my own pack threatened the life of my child, and I knew nothing about it. You had already rejected me in front of everyone, Alira said quietly. Who exactly did you expect me to go to for protection? You had made it clear I was not to be trusted. Reporting a threat to your guards would have meant explaining that I believed myself pregnant with your child, information I was not yet ready to share with anyone, least of all people who had just watched you cast me aside as a possible spy. Cale pressed his palms against his eyes, the weight of everything he had failed to protect crashing down on him with devastating clarity. I am so sorry, he said, the words feeling entirely insufficient against the magnitude of what she had endured. I am so sorry that my failures left you with no one to turn to, that my own pride created a situation where you had to face something like that entirely alone. I am telling you this now, Alira said, not to make you feel guilty, though I understand that you do, and perhaps you should. I am telling you because I need you to understand why I have spent 4 years being so careful, so guarded, so unwilling to simply trust that everything might now be safe. Whoever threatened me that night is likely still within your pack, still holding whatever position of influence allowed them to move so freely and speak so confidently about the possibility of eliminating an unwanted heir. If Ronan's existence becomes known publicly now, that danger does not simply disappear because 4 years have passed. Cale sat with this realization for a long moment, understanding settling over him with the weight of genuine fear, not for himself, but for the son he had only just discovered, for the woman who had protected that son alone, against threats she should never have had to face without support. I will find out who did this, he said finally, his voice hardening with determination. I will find them, and I will make certain that neither you nor Ronan is ever threatened again. But Alira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. What is it? Alira asked. Do you have any idea who it might have been? Cale asked. Any detail at all that might help me identify them? A voice, a particular phrase, anything that might have stayed with you over the years? Alira was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the memory over carefully in her mind, examining details she had perhaps deliberately tried not to dwell on too closely in the years since. Their voice was disguised, she said slowly, but there was one thing. They wore a ring, an unusual one, silver with a small dark stone set into it, shaped almost like a crescent moon. I only saw it briefly, when they gestured toward the door as they were leaving, but it caught the candlelight in a way I have never quite forgotten. Cale's mind raced through the faces of his inner circle, searching for any memory of such a ring, though nothing immediately surfaced. Still, it was a detail, a starting point, something concrete he could begin investigating once he returned to Ashgrove territory. Thank you for telling me this, he said. I know it could not have been easy to revisit. I have carried it alone for 4 years, Alira said, and for the first time since he had arrived in Brindlewood, genuine vulnerability crept into her voice, breaking through the careful composure she had maintained throughout their conversation. It is strange, having someone else finally know. Cale reached across the small table, hesitating only briefly, before gently covering her hand with his own. She did not pull away, though he felt her tense slightly at the contact. Years of guardedness, not so easily set aside, despite the honesty they had just shared. "You are not alone anymore," he said quietly. "Whatever happens between us, whatever you decide about how much of a role I am allowed to play going forward, I promise you this. You and Ronan will never again face a threat like that without someone standing beside you, ready to fight for your safety." Alira looked up at him then, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, any trace of the calculated political thinking that had once led him to reject her without a second thought. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, at least enough to allow the smallest measure of trust back into her guarded heart. "We will see," she said softly, though something in her tone suggested that the door she had kept firmly closed for 4 years had at last begun to open, even if only slightly. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment beside the fire, that the very threat Alira had just described was already aware of Cale's presence in Brindlewood, already receiving reports from loyal informants about the Alpha King's unexpected and extended absence from his territory, already beginning to calculate what steps might need to be taken should the truth about Ronan's existence become known to the wider pack. The danger that had chased Alira into hiding 4 years earlier had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting, patient and watchful, for exactly this moment. The following morning, Alira decided it was time for Cale to properly meet his son, not as a distant figure glimpsed across a town square, but as the father he was only now beginning to understand himself to be. She brought Cale into the small kitchen, where Ronan sat eating breakfast, his dark hair sticking up in every direction from sleep, his gray eyes bright with the particular curiosity of a child encountering something new and interesting. "Ronan," Alira said gently, crouching down beside her son's chair, "there is someone here who would like to meet you." Ronan looked up at Cale with open, unguarded curiosity, the kind of directness only young children seemed capable of, studying the tall stranger standing uncertainly near the doorway, with an intensity that made Cale feel oddly exposed. "Who is he?" Ronan asked, looking back at his mother. Alira glanced briefly at Cale, a silent question passing between them, and Cale gave the smallest nod, understanding that this moment belonged to her to navigate however she thought best. "This is Cale," Alira said carefully. "He is someone very important, sweetheart. He is your father." Ronan's eyes widened, and for a long moment, he simply stared at Cale in silence, processing information that clearly did not fit neatly into whatever mental picture he had built over the years, about the absent, mysterious figure his mother had always described as living far away. "My father?" Ronan repeated slowly, as though testing the word. "You said he lived far away and didn't know about me." "That was true," Alira said gently. "But he found us now, and he wants very much to know you, if that is something you would like too." Ronan turned his attention back to Cale, studying him with the same fierce concentration Cale had noticed in the town square, the same intensity that had first caught his attention days earlier. "You have the same eyes as me," Ronan said finally, his voice carrying a note of wonder rather than suspicion. Cale felt something crack open in his chest at those simple words, an emotion so overwhelming he had to fight to keep his composure. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with his son for the first time. "I do," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It seems you inherited that from me." "Mama says my eyes are unusual," Ronan said. "She says most people around here have brown eyes or blue eyes, not gray ones." "Where I come from," Cale said carefully, "gray eyes like ours are considered quite special. They mean something important about who we are." Ronan considered this information seriously, the way children often weighed new facts against their existing understanding of the world. "Are you a king?" he asked suddenly, surprising both Cale and Alira with the directness of the question. "Mama never said you were a king, but you dress like the pictures of kings in my storybooks." Cale glanced briefly at Alira, uncertain how much she wanted revealed at this early stage, but she gave a small nod, indicating that honesty, at least on this point, seemed like the right path forward. Yes, Chaol admitted, I am a king. I rule over a pack of wolves in a territory quite far from here. Ronan's eyes lit up with the particular excitement only a 4-year-old could bring to such a revelation. Does that mean I'm a prince? He asked, practically bouncing in his seat with sudden enthusiasm. Despite the weight and complexity of everything happening around them, Chaol found himself almost smiling at his son's immediate leap to the most exciting possible interpretation of the news. In a manner of speaking, he said, though being a prince comes with responsibilities too, not just exciting titles. What kind of responsibilities? Ronan asked, his curiosity clearly far outweighing any concern about potential burdens. We can talk about that another time, Alira interjected gently, sensing perhaps that the conversation was moving faster than either she or Chaol had fully prepared for. For now, why don't you finish your breakfast, and then maybe you and Chaol can spend some time together this morning, if you would like that. Ronan nodded eagerly, turning his attention back to his food with the easy resilience of childhood, already seeming to accept this enormous shift in his understanding of the world, with far less difficulty than either adult in the room. Chaol watched him eat, something warm and fierce, and entirely unfamiliar settling into his chest, a feeling he slowly recognized as love, immediate and overwhelming, for a child he had known for less than an hour. The rest of that morning passed in a way Chaol would remember for the rest of his life. He walked with Ronan through the fields surrounding Brindlewood, listening as his son chattered endlessly about his favorite games, his best friend from the town who lived 2 houses down, the strange dream he had experienced the previous night involving a talking fox. Chaol found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, surprised by how easily conversation flowed with his son, how naturally Ronan seemed to trust him, despite having known him for only a few hours. At one point, as they walked along the edge of a small stream, Ronan's foot slipped on a loose stone, and before the boy could fully lose his balance, Chaol's hand shot out instinctively, steadying him with a firm, protective grip. Ronan looked up at him with a bright, easy smile, entirely unaware of the significance of that small moment for Chaol, who felt something settle firmly into place within himself, an instinct he had not known he possessed until that exact instant, the fierce, immediate protectiveness of a father toward his child. Thank you, Ronan said simply, and continued on as though nothing important had happened at all, already distracted by a colorful bird that had caught his attention nearby. Chaol watched him run ahead, chasing after the bird with the boundless energy of childhood, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something like genuine hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers still lurked from the threat that had chased Alira into hiding, whatever difficult work remained in rebuilding trust between himself and the woman who had raised this remarkable child entirely alone, Chaol found himself determined, more strongly than he had ever been determined about anything before, to earn a permanent place in his son's life. Later that afternoon, as Ronan napped and Alira worked in the bakery below, Chaol found a quiet moment to speak with Margaret, who had watched the morning's events unfold with a mixture of cautious optimism and lingering wariness. He is a remarkable boy, Chaol said, settling into a chair near the small kitchen fire. He is, Margaret agreed, though her tone remained guarded. Alira has done everything possible to give him a good life, despite everything working against her. I hope you understand the weight of what you are asking to become part of now, Alpha King. This is not a simple matter of visiting occasionally and calling yourself a father. I understand, Chaol said, and found that he meant it more deeply than he had understood anything in years. I intend to prove that understanding through actions, not simply words. Starting with finding whoever threatened Alira 4 years ago, and making certain neither she nor Ronan ever has reason to fear such a threat again. Margaret studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening slightly, though her wariness did not fully disappear. See that you do, she said, because I have watched that young woman rebuild herself from nothing, alone, while carrying the weight of a threat she could tell no one about. If you truly care for her, and for that boy, prove it, by making certain the danger that drove her away is finally dealt with, once and for all. Chaol nodded, resolve hardening within him. He had spent 4 years avoiding the truth of what his rejection had cost. 4 years telling himself that pride and caution had been reasonable justifications for turning away the one bond the moon had ever offered him. Now, faced with the reality of the family he had nearly lost forever, and the danger that still threatened them both, he understood that the time for avoidance had ended. He would return to Ashgrove territory soon, but not to resume his old life as though nothing had changed. He would return with a singular purpose, to uncover the traitor within his own inner circle who had threatened his mate and unborn son, and to ensure, once and for all, that the family he had so nearly destroyed through his own pride would finally be safe enough to claim the future they deserved. Chaol returned to Ashgrove territory 3 days later, leaving Alira and Ronan in Brindlewood with a promise that he would return soon, and that in the meantime, he would ensure their protection through trusted guards he would send discreetly, men and women whose loyalty he had tested repeatedly over the years and had never once found wanting. Elira had been hesitant to accept even this small measure of help, her years of independence making her instinctively wary of relying on anyone connected to Ashgrove territory, but Margaret had gently convinced her that some additional protection, given the danger they now knew still lingered, would be wise. Back at his own hall, Chaol wasted no time beginning his investigation. He called together only his most trusted guards, men who had served him loyally for years and whose discretion he trusted completely, and explained, in careful and measured terms, that he needed to identify anyone within his inner circle who possessed a particular silver ring set with a dark stone shaped like a crescent moon. The investigation proved slower and more difficult than Chaol had hoped. Many members of his pack wore jewelry of various kinds, and cross-referencing every ring against Alira's description required careful, patient work that could not be rushed without risking exposure to whoever had made the original threat. Chaol forced himself to be patient, though every day that passed without an answer felt like an eternity, his mind constantly returning to Brindlewood, to the family he had left behind, and desperately wanted to protect properly. It was nearly 2 weeks into the investigation when one of Chaol's guards, a quiet and observant man named Edwin, who had served the pack for over a decade, approached him privately with information that made everything suddenly click into place with horrifying clarity. "Alpha King," Edwin said, keeping his voice low even though they stood alone in Chaol's private study, "I believe I have identified the ring you described. I have seen it before, though I did not think much of it at the time. It belongs to Beta Callum." Chaol felt a cold chill move through him at the name. Callum had served as his beta for nearly 6 years, one of the highest positions of trust and authority within the entire pack structure, second only to Chaol himself in terms of influence over pack decisions and internal politics. If Callum was responsible for threatening Alira, it meant the danger to his family ran far deeper and closer than Chaol had initially feared. "Are you certain?" Chaol asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I am confident, Alpha King," Edwin said. "I have seen him wear it on several occasions, always on formal pack occasions, though he rarely draws attention to it. It matches the description you gave precisely, silver with a dark stone, shaped like a crescent moon." Chaol sat with this information for a long moment, his mind racing through years of memories, searching for any earlier signs he might have missed, any indication that his most trusted beta harbored the kind of ruthless ambition necessary to threaten an innocent, pregnant woman simply to protect his own position within the pack hierarchy. He thought of countless private conversations, strategic decisions made together, moments where he had trusted Callum's judgment completely, and felt sick at the possibility that such trust had been so thoroughly misplaced. Why would he do this? Chaol asked, though he suspected he already understood the answer even as he spoke the question aloud. Beta Callum has always been deeply protective of his position within the pack, Alpha King, Edwin said carefully. An heir born from your bonded mate would have secured a clear line of succession that placed Callum's own influence, and perhaps his own ambitions regarding future leadership, in a considerably weaker position. With no clear heir, and with your own reluctance to fully trust anyone close to you, Callum has held significant unofficial power for years, power he may have feared losing entirely had a legitimate heir been born and raised within the pack structure. The explanation made a terrible kind of sense, and Chaol felt fury building steadily within him, as the full picture came into focus. Callum had not simply disagreed with the idea of Cale accepting his mate. He had actively worked, behind Cale's back, using threats and intimidation, to ensure that any potential heir never had the chance to exist within the pack at all. It was not simply ambition, it was a calculated, ruthless act of betrayal against both Cale and Alira, one that had nearly cost an innocent child his life before he was even born. "I need proof," Cale said finally, forcing himself to think strategically, despite the anger coursing through him. Suspicion alone, even strong suspicion, will not be enough to bring formal charges against a beta of his standing within the pack. I need something concrete, something that will hold up when I confront him and when I explain the situation to the wider pack, who will undoubtedly have questions once this becomes known. "I will continue investigating quietly, Alpha King," Edwin said. "There may be others within the pack who witnessed something over the years, small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but might now prove relevant, given what we suspect." Over the following days, Edwin and a small handful of trusted guards worked carefully to gather additional evidence, speaking quietly with pack members who had served for many years, cross-referencing timelines and movements from the period immediately following Alira's departure 4 years earlier. Slowly, a clearer and more damning picture began to emerge. Several older pack members recalled Callum expressing private concerns, in the days immediately following Cale's rejection of Alira, about the complications an unexpected heir might have caused, had she truly been carrying Cale's child. One elderly healer, who had long since retired from active duty within the pack, remembered a conversation with Callum in which he had asked, seemingly casually at the time, detailed questions about how early pregnancy could be confirmed in a newly bonded mate, questions that seemed innocent enough in isolation, but took on a far more sinister meaning in light of everything Cale now understood. Perhaps most damning of all, one of the younger guards, a woman named Priscilla, who had only recently joined Cale's trusted circle, recalled overhearing a brief, tense conversation between Callum and an unfamiliar visitor to the Packlands roughly 2 weeks after Alira's departure, a conversation in which Callum had spoken quietly about ensuring that certain complications had been, in his words, permanently resolved. At the time, Priscilla had assumed the conversation referred to some unrelated pack matter and had thought nothing more of it. Now, reflecting on the timing and phrasing with fresh understanding, the memory took on chilling new significance. Armed with this growing body of circumstantial evidence, Cale understood that the moment had nearly arrived to confront Callum directly, but he also understood the delicate nature of what he was about to attempt. Callum remained a powerful and respected figure within the pack, with allies and supporters who might not immediately believe accusations against him, particularly accusations rooted in years-old suspicions and second-hand memories rather than absolute, undeniable proof. Cale knew he needed to proceed carefully, gathering just enough additional evidence to ensure that when he finally made his move, the truth would be undeniable to everyone watching, that justice could be delivered, not through quiet, private punishment that might be dismissed as personal grievance, but through a public reckoning that would leave no doubt about Callum's guilt and would simultaneously allow Cale to finally, formally acknowledge Alira and Ronan as his true mate and heir before the entire pack. It was, Cale understood, the only way to ensure their lasting safety. A quiet resolution, handled behind closed doors, would leave room for whispers and doubts to linger, room for Callum's remaining allies to potentially continue posing a threat even after his removal from power. Only a full, public reckoning, conducted according to pack law and tradition, would ensure that everyone understood, beyond any possible doubt, that Alira and Ronan were protected, respected, and formally welcomed into the very heart of Ashgrove territory. As the investigation continued gathering strength, Cale found himself sending word to Brindlewood more frequently, careful, coded messages meant to reassure Alira that progress was being made, without revealing details that might endanger the ongoing investigation, should the messages somehow be intercepted. He longed to return to her and Ronan immediately, to simply gather them close and keep them safe within his own protection. But he understood, with the discipline of a king who had spent years learning patience even when every instinct urged immediate action, that rushing the process now, before the evidence against Callum was fully secured, risked everything he was trying to protect. The reckoning was coming. Cale could feel it building, the way pressure builds before a storm finally breaks. And when it arrived, he intended to make absolutely certain that nothing would ever again threaten the family he had so nearly lost through his own earlier failures. 3 weeks after Cale first discovered Ronan's existence in the Brindlewood town square, the evidence against Callum had grown substantial enough that Cale felt confident moving forward with a direct confrontation. He had gathered testimony from 4 separate pack members, each recalling different pieces of the puzzle that, when assembled together, painted a clear and damning portrait of a beta who had used quiet threats and intimidation to protect his own position within the pack hierarchy, regardless of the human cost involved. Before confronting Callum directly, Cale made one more trip to Brindlewood, wanting to see Alira and Ronan once more, and wanting to discuss with Alira exactly how he planned to proceed, given that the coming confrontation would inevitably require her own involvement, at least in terms of confirming certain details about the threat she had received 4 years earlier. He found Ronan in considerably better spirits than during his previous visit, more comfortable now with Cale's presence, greeting him with an enthusiastic hug the moment he arrived that caught Cale entirely off guard and left him feeling a warmth he suspected would stay with him for the rest of his life. Alira, too, seemed slightly more relaxed, though the careful wariness she maintained around him had not disappeared entirely, and Cale understood that such trust would take considerably longer than a few weeks to fully rebuild. That evening, after Ronan had gone to bed, Cale explained everything he had discovered to Alira, watching her expression shift from cautious hope to something harder and more resolute as the full picture of Callum's betrayal became clear. "I want to be there," Alira said firmly, once Cale had finished explaining his plan to confront Callum publicly before the pack. "If this is going to happen, I want to stand there myself and face the man who threatened my son's life before he was even born." Cale hesitated, old protective instincts warring with his growing understanding that Alira was not someone who needed or wanted to be shielded from difficult confrontations, that she had proven, repeatedly, over 4 years of raising their son alone, that she possessed more than enough strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Are you certain?" he asked. "It will not be easy. Callum has allies within the pack who may not simply accept the accusation quietly, and there is always some risk in confronting someone of his standing so directly. I have spent 4 years being careful, being hidden, being afraid of exactly this kind of confrontation," Alira said, her voice steady with a determination Cale recognized as the same fierce strength that had first drawn the moon's attention toward her all those years ago. "I am done being afraid, Cale. If Callum is going to answer for what he did, I want to be there to see it happen." Cale nodded, respect and admiration mixing together with his lingering protective instincts. "Then we will do this together," he said. "But I want to arrange proper protection for you and Ronan throughout the process. Not because I doubt your strength, but because Callum may prove desperate once he realizes his position has been discovered, and desperate people sometimes act in unpredictable and dangerous ways." Alira agreed to this reasonable precaution, and together they began planning the details of their return to Ashgrove territory, coordinating with Margaret about Ronan's care during the more sensitive parts of the confrontation, and with Edwin about ensuring adequate security throughout the process. They arrived back at Ashgrove territory 5 days later, traveling with a substantial guard escort that Cale had arranged specifically for their protection. The sight of the great stone hall rising above the trees brought a complicated wave of emotion crashing over Alira, memories of that final, humiliating night, mixing uncomfortably with the strange, tentative hope she now carried about what might finally be set right. Cale had arranged for Alira and Ronan to stay in secure guest quarters within the hall itself, close enough to his own chambers that he could personally ensure their safety, while final preparations were made for the formal confrontation with Callum. He had decided, after careful consideration, that the confrontation needed to happen during a full pack gathering, similar in structure to the very ceremony where he had originally rejected Alira, so that the pack could witness both the exposure of Callum's betrayal and Cale's formal acknowledgement of Alira and Ronan as his true family, all within the same significant moment. The night before the planned gathering, Cale found himself unable to sleep, his mind cycling through every possible way the confrontation might unfold, every contingency he needed to prepare for, should Callum attempt to deny the accusations or rally support among sympathetic pack members. He eventually made his way to the guest quarters where Elira and Ronan were staying, needing, more than anything, simply to see them, to reassure himself that they remained safe within his own walls. He found Elira awake as well, sitting quietly by the window of her room, while Ronan slept peacefully in the adjoining chamber. She looked up as Kale entered, something understanding passing between them without need for words, both of them carrying the weight of the same nervous anticipation about what tomorrow would bring. "Do you think it will go well?" Elira asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I do not know," Kale admitted honestly. Callum has spent years building relationships and loyalty within certain factions of the pack. There may be some who refuse to believe the accusations, at least initially, but I have gathered enough evidence that I believe the truth will ultimately prevail, even if the process proves difficult. Elira nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window and the moon visible beyond it. The same moon that had originally bound them together 4 years earlier. The same moon that had witnessed both their rejection and now, perhaps, their reconciliation. "I keep thinking about that night," she said quietly. "Standing in that hall, believing my entire future had just been destroyed. I never imagined it might eventually lead back here, to this moment, with everything so different than I could have possibly predicted. I think about that night constantly," Kale admitted, moving to sit beside her near the window. "Every mistake I made, every assumption I allowed myself to believe without question. I cannot undo what happened, Elira. I cannot give back the 4 years you spent raising our son alone, carrying the burden of a threat you could tell no one about. But I intend to spend whatever years remain proving that I understand exactly what I nearly threw away." Elira turned to look at him, something softening in her expression that had not been present during their earlier, more guarded conversations. "I believe you are trying," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I see the effort, even when old wounds make it difficult for me to fully trust it yet. That is all I can ask for," Kale said. "Time, and the chance to keep proving myself, one day at a time." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the moon climb higher over the packlands, both of them aware that tomorrow would bring a reckoning that had been 4 long years in the making, a confrontation that would finally expose the truth of Callum's betrayal, and, hopefully, allow them to begin building the future that had been so nearly destroyed on a similar night, beneath this very same moon, 4 years earlier. Neither of them slept much that night, but for the first time in a long while, the wakefulness felt less like anxious dread and more like anticipation, the quiet, nervous hope of 2 people standing at the edge of something that might finally set right what pride and fear had once torn apart. Tomorrow, the truth would finally be revealed before the entire pack. Tomorrow, Callum would face the consequences of his betrayal. And tomorrow, if everything proceeded as Kale hoped, Elira and Ronan would finally be acknowledged, publicly and permanently, as the family that had always belonged at the very heart of Ashgrove territory. The Great Hall filled quickly the following evening, word having spread throughout the pack that their Alpha King had called an urgent gathering, the same hall where, 4 years earlier, Kale had stood before everyone and rejected the woman the moon had chosen for him. Now, as pack members filed in and found their places, murmurs of curiosity and speculation rippled through the crowd, many recognizing Elira, despite the years that had passed, whispers spreading quickly as people began to piece together fragments of what this unusual gathering might mean. Elira stood near the front of the hall, Ronan's small hand held firmly in her own, doing her best to project calm confidence, despite the nervous energy building in her chest. Ronan, sensing the seriousness of the occasion, even without fully understanding its significance, stood quietly beside her, his gray eyes wide as he took in the grandeur of the hall and the sheer number of unfamiliar faces surrounding them. Kale entered last, moving to stand at the front of the gathering, with the same commanding presence he always carried, though those who knew him well might have noticed a certain tension in his shoulders, a controlled intensity that suggested tonight's gathering carried far more weight than an ordinary pack meeting. Callum stood among the other senior pack members near the front, apparently unaware of what was about to unfold, his expression carrying only mild curiosity about the nature of this unexpected gathering. Kale raised his hand, and the hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on their Alpha King, as they waited for him to explain the reason behind this unusual assembly. 4 years ago, Cale began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, I stood in this very spot and rejected my bonded mate before all of you, believing I was protecting this pack from an unknown and potentially dangerous threat. That decision was the greatest mistake of my life, and tonight, I intend to correct it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd immediately, eyes turning toward Alira, who stood tall despite the weight of hundreds of gazes suddenly focused upon her. Cale continued, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was revealing. What I did not know that night, he continued, was that Alira Voss was carrying my child. She fled this territory not simply because of my rejection, though that alone would have been reason enough, but because someone within this very hall threatened her life, and the life of our unborn son, warning her that an unwanted heir would not be permitted to survive. The murmurs grew louder now, shock and disbelief rippling through the assembled pack members. Cale's gaze swept across the crowd before settling directly on Callum, whose expression had shifted from mild curiosity to something more guarded, a flicker of alarm crossing his features before he managed to smooth his expression back into careful neutrality. I have spent the past several weeks investigating this threat, Cale continued, and I have gathered substantial evidence pointing directly to the individual responsible. Beta Callum, step forward. A collective gasp swept through the hall as every eye turned toward Callum, who stood frozen for a moment before forcing himself to step forward, his expression carefully composed despite the visible tension in his posture. Alpha King, he said, his voice carrying forced calm, I do not understand these accusations. I have served this pack loyally for 6 years. 4 years ago, Cale said, his voice hardening, you visited my rejected mate's quarters late at night, wearing a silver ring set with a dark stone shaped like a crescent moon, and you threatened her life and the life of the child she carried, should that child prove to be my heir. Callum's face paled visibly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. This is a serious accusation, Alpha King. Based on what evidence exactly? Cale gestured, and Edwin stepped forward, along with the other pack members who had provided testimony over the past several weeks, each one recounting their memories and observations regarding Callum's suspicious behavior and conversations in the weeks following Alira's departure. As each testimony was given, the crowd's murmurs grew more pointed, more accusatory, sympathy shifting rapidly away from the beta who had, until moments ago, been among the most respected figures within the entire pack. When the testimonies concluded, Cale turned back to Callum, whose composed facade had entirely crumbled under the weight of the accumulated evidence. Do you deny these accounts? Cale asked, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. Callum's shoulders slumped slightly, understanding, perhaps, that continued denial would only further damage whatever remained of his standing before the pack. I did what I believed necessary to protect this pack's stability, he said finally, his voice carrying a defensive edge rather than genuine remorse. An heir born from a rejected mate, a woman with no known lineage, would have created chaos and uncertainty regarding succession. I acted to prevent that instability. You threatened the life of an innocent woman and an unborn child, Cale said, fury barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. Not to protect this pack, but to protect your own influence and position. Do not insult the memory of everything this pack stands for by pretending your actions served anything beyond your own ambition. Callum said nothing further, his silence serving as its own form of confirmation before the assembled crowd. Cale turned to address the full gathering, his voice carrying clearly across the now utterly silent hall. Pack law demands accountability for threats made against a bonded mate and rightful heir, Cale said. I formally challenge Beta Callum to answer for his betrayal through proper pack tradition, that all present might witness justice served according to our laws, rather than through quiet, private punishment that leaves room for doubt or lingering sympathy toward actions that nearly cost an innocent child his life. What followed was a formal challenge, conducted according to ancient pack tradition, a controlled and supervised confrontation meant not for violence beyond what tradition strictly required, but for the pack to witness Callum formally stripped of his position and authority, his guilt acknowledged before the entire assembled community, in a manner that left no room for future doubt or divided loyalty. Callum, understanding the weight of the evidence against him and the futility of further resistance, accepted the formal consequences of his betrayal, his position as Beta stripped from him permanently, his standing within the pack reduced to that of an ordinary member under close watch, with the clear understanding that any further transgression would result in permanent exile from Ashgrove territory. Once the matter of Callum's punishment had been formally settled, Cale turned back toward Alira and Ronan, who had watched the entire proceeding with a mixture of vindication and lingering tension. He extended his hand toward them, and Alira, after only the briefest hesitation, stepped forward with Ronan beside her, moving to stand at Cale's side before the entire assembled pack. 4 years ago, Cale said, his voice carrying new warmth despite the formal setting, I made the gravest mistake of my life by rejecting the mate the moon itself chose for me. Tonight, before all of you, I formally and permanently acknowledge Alira Voss as my true and bonded mate, and Ronan as my son and rightful heir to Ashgrove territory. The hall erupted, not with the murmurs of confused speculation that had filled it just moments before, but with something closer to genuine celebration. Pack members, who had witnessed the original rejection, now witnessing its correction, the wrong of that earlier night, finally set right before their very eyes. Alira felt tears she had not expected finally spill down her cheeks, 4 years of careful composure and quiet strength giving way, at last, to genuine relief and something like hope for the future she had once believed impossible. Ronan, sensing the significance of the moment, even without fully understanding every detail, looked up at his mother, and then at Cale, with wide, wondering eyes. "Does this mean we get to stay here now?" he asked, his voice carrying through the sudden quiet that had followed the crowd's initial celebration. Cale knelt down to his son's level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "If your mother agrees," he said, glancing up at Alira with a question in his eyes, "then yes. This is your home now, Ronan. Both of yours, for as long as you want it to be." Alira looked around at the hall, at the faces of pack members who had watched her humiliation 4 years earlier, and now witnessed her vindication. At the man who had finally, after everything, proven himself willing to fight for the family he had nearly destroyed through his own pride and fear. Slowly she nodded, allowing herself, for the first time in 4 years, to fully believe that the future might hold something better than mere survival. "Yes," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the hall. "This is our home now." The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Ashgrove territory, as Alira and Ronan settled into their new life, within the great hall that had once represented nothing but pain and rejection for Alira, now slowly transforming into something she had never expected to feel again, a genuine sense of belonging. The transition was not without its difficulties. Years of guardedness could not simply disappear overnight, and Alira found herself, more than once, catching herself waiting for something to go wrong, for the fragile peace they had built to somehow collapse the way her earlier hopes had collapsed 4 years before. Cale proved patient with these lingering fears, understanding that trust, once broken so completely, required consistent effort to rebuild, rather than simply grand gestures made in a single dramatic moment. He made a point of involving Alira in pack decisions, valuing her perspective openly before the other advisors and senior pack members, ensuring that everyone understood she held genuine authority and respect within Ashgrove territory, not merely a ceremonial position granted out of guilt or obligation. Ronan, meanwhile, adjusted to his new surroundings with the remarkable flexibility that children often possess, quickly making friends among the pack's other young members, and taking obvious delight in exploring the vast grounds surrounding the Great Hall, so different from the small, quiet streets of Brindlewood he had known his entire life. He remained close to Margaret as well, who agreed, after some gentle persuasion, to relocate to Ashgrove territory herself, unwilling to be too far removed from the boy she had helped raise since his earliest days. Cale made a particular effort to spend meaningful time with his son each day, learning the rhythms of fatherhood that he had missed during the first 4 years of Ronan's life, determined not to let any more time pass without building the kind of relationship he had never imagined himself capable of forming. He taught Ronan simple lessons about pack history and tradition, careful always to frame such lessons not as burdens of future responsibility, but as stories meant to spark curiosity and connection to the heritage that was now rightfully his. Slowly, over the course of several months, something genuine and unforced began growing between Chaol and Alira as well, something neither of them had expected to find again after everything that had happened between them. It was not a return to whatever might have existed had that first night gone differently 4 years earlier, but something new entirely, built carefully on a foundation of hard-earned trust and mutual respect, rather than the untested promise of a moon bond alone. One evening, several months after the formal acknowledgement before the pack, Chaol found Alira sitting beneath the same oak tree at the edge of the fields where they had first spoken honestly after his discovery of Ronan's existence in Brindlewood. He sat down beside her quietly, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "I have been thinking about that night 4 years ago," Alira said quietly, not needing to specify which night she meant. "I used to think about it with nothing but anger and pain. Now, strangely, I find myself almost grateful for how everything unfolded, difficult as that journey was." Chaol glanced at her, surprised by the sentiment. "Grateful?" he asked. "Even after everything you endured, alone, protecting Ronan from threats you should never have had to face by yourself?" "I do not mean I am grateful for the pain," Alira clarified. "I mean that everything I endured shaped the person I became, shaped the mother I was forced to become for Ronan's sake, and in some strange way, it also shaped who you have become. I do not think the man who stood in that hall 4 years ago, so certain and so cold, could have become the father Ronan needed. It took losing everything for you to understand what truly mattered." Chaol considered this for a long moment, understanding the truth in her words, even as it remained difficult to fully reconcile with the guilt he still carried, for the pain his earlier choices had caused. "I wish there had been another way," he said finally. "A way for me to learn that lesson without costing you 4 years of fear and hardship." "Perhaps there was," Alira said, "but there was not, and dwelling too long on paths we did not take serves little purpose now. What matters is what we build going forward, together, for Ronan's sake and for our own." Chaol reached over and gently took her hand, and this time, Alira did not tense at the contact the way she once had, allowing herself instead to simply exist in the quiet comfort of the moment. 4 years of careful guardedness, finally beginning to soften into something resembling genuine peace. "I love you," Chaol said quietly, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that had been entirely absent from anything he had offered her 4 years earlier. "I do not say that lightly, and I understand if you are not ready to hear it, or to say it back. But I need you to know that whatever bond the moon created between us that first night has only grown stronger through everything we have endured since, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that this love is genuine, not merely obligation or guilt." Alira looked at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it so many times since his arrival in Brindlewood, weighing the sincerity of his words against the pain of old memories that still occasionally surfaced, despite everything that had changed. Finally, something in her expression softened completely. 4 years of careful walls, finally, fully coming down. "I love you too," she said quietly. "I think I have for longer than I wanted to admit, even during the years I told myself I hated you for what you did. It is strange how the heart holds on to things even when the mind insists otherwise." They sat together beneath the oak tree, as the sun finished setting, the same tree where their reconciliation had first begun months earlier, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky above Ashgrove territory. In the distance, they could hear Ronan's laughter carrying across the grounds as he played with several other pack children, the sound bringing a smile to both their faces, a reminder of everything they had already overcome, and everything still ahead of them. The pack itself had settled into a new rhythm since Callum's removal and Alira's formal acknowledgement, the lingering tension of that difficult night gradually giving way to genuine acceptance and, in many cases, real warmth toward the woman who had endured so much and the child who represented the future of their territory. Alira found herself building genuine friendships among the pack members, particularly among several women close to her own age, who had initially approached her with cautious curiosity, but had gradually come to respect her quiet strength and obvious devotion to her son. Chaol's own leadership style shifted as well in the months following the reckoning, his earlier coldness and suspicion giving way to a more open, more collaborative approach to ruling that many of his advisors privately noted made him a considerably more effective and beloved Alpha King than he had been during the harder, more guarded years following Alira's original departure. He understood now, in a way he never had before, that true strength did not come from refusing to trust anyone, but from having the courage to trust the right people and to fight fiercely for those who mattered most. As the seasons changed and Ronan grew, the memory of that painful night in the Great Hall 4 years earlier gradually faded into simply another chapter of a much longer story, one that had ultimately led to healing rather than permanent destruction. Alira often thought, in her quieter moments, about the promise she had made to herself on that first difficult morning leaving Ashgrove territory, the promise to protect her son no matter the cost, to ensure he never felt unwanted or unloved. She had kept that promise, through every difficult year in Brindlewood, through every quiet fear about threats that might one day resurface, through the uncertain and delicate process of allowing Chaol back into their lives, despite every reasonable instinct that had once urged her toward caution. And now, watching her son grow up surrounded by genuine love, from herself, from Chaol, from an entire pack that had come to embrace him fully as their future, Alira understood that the promise had not simply been kept, but had blossomed into something far greater than she had ever dared to hope for during those long, uncertain years alone. The Alpha King, who had once rejected his pregnant mate out of fear and pride, had, through hard-earned wisdom and genuine transformation, become the father and partner that both Alira and Ronan deserved. And though the path that had led them there had been marked by pain, neither of them would ever fully forget. The family they had ultimately built together stood as proof that even the deepest wounds, given enough time, enough honesty, and enough courage to change, could finally heal into something whole, and lasting, and true.